Curley, known by the name Crow Ash Isha, was one of the indigenous scouts who assisted the U.S. 7th Cavalry and managed to escape Custer's defeat at Little Bighorn in 1876. In the 1880s, when D.F. Barry produced this image, the United States was consolidating reservations and assimilation policies that profoundly altered the way of life of the Crow Nation. Between 1890 and 1900, photographer C.S. Richmond documented a group of dine at Window Rock, then the center of the Navajo Reservation in the Arizona Territory. The scene highlights the post-Navajo Wars transition, when federal assimilation policies were changing modes of subsistence and mobility. One can observe mixed clothing, wooden structures, and the local sandy terrain. Philip Return, a Lakota scout in the service of the United States Army at the end of the 19th century, poses in military uniform, a typical scene of indigenous co-optation policy after the Sioux War of 1877. The image, made by Jeffrey Duncan between 1880 and 1900, reflects the forced transition of the Plains peoples into the reservation system and the resulting identity tensions. Charles S. Stobie, Western artist and indigenous scout, poses mounted on a pinto horse in Colorado in the 1890s, during the final colonial advances on the lands of the Great Plains. A survivor of the Indian Wars and an interpreter between Arapaho and the Army, he balanced serving on campaigns with painting scenes of rights and frontier clashes. An indigenous person identified uncertainly as Apache or Yuma, photographed by the F.A. Hartwell Studio in Phoenix, Arizona Territory, around 1880. The scene reflects the period when railroad expansion, military campaigns, and federal treaties were redrawing the Southwest, documenting Native presence in the new urban center undergoing rapid economic transition. In 1904, on the banks of the Navajo River, Arizona, an Apache man pauses to quench his thirst beside his horse, recalling the survival routine of the indigenous peoples of the Southwest after the imposition of federal reservations. The scene reflects dependency on waterways in a semi-desert territory and marks the contrast between traditional mobility and the colonial siege on tribal lands. An image captured by William Henry Jackson in 1877 shows Huakee, known as Eagle Rattleman, a member of the Dakota peoples in then newly surveyed territory, in the post-Sioux War period of conflicts with the United States. The framing emphasizes ceremonial attire and reveals how indigenous leaders reaffirmed cultural identity in the face of colonial expansion. On the outskirts of San Juan, New Mexico Territory, still influenced by Pueblo communities, a girl poses wearing buckskin boots, attire associated with indigenous adaptation to 19th century trade. Captured by Frederick Monson around 1900, the scene reveals childhood daily life during the transition between Mexican dominion and U.S. administration. High Bear, an indigenous healer, poses in 1870 before the lens of Weehook, an itinerant photographer who traveled through Colorado after the Civil War. The image, taken on the edge of the reservation, attests to the clash between native spiritual practices and the railroad expansion sweeping the West. By fixing the shaman in the frame, Hook offered Eastern salons a vision of a people under pressure. In 1873, delegates of the Apsaluuk Nation traveled to Washington to negotiate peace terms and territorial boundaries with the federal government. In this image, captured at the Ulka Brothers studio, the delegation is seen wearing a mix of Western dress and tribal insignia, a sign of the intercultural diplomacy that marked the post-Fort Laramie Treaty era of 1868. James A. Garfield, chief of the Jicarilla Apache, poses around 1900 before the camera of Rose and Hopkins. The scene reflects the moment when Native leaders visited Washington to negotiate lands and subsidies after the U.S. government established the reservation in northern New Mexico, marking the forced transition from nomadism to cattle ranching and agriculture. Aakia boat, called Two Axes among the Kiowa, was photographed in 1898 by the Frank Reinhardt Studio at the Trans-Mississippi Exposition in Omaha. His ceremonial attire dialogues with the recent imposition of reservations in the Oklahoma Territory, marked by the Kiowa defeat in the 1874-75 conflicts, and the new federal policies of schooling and control. A 1901 photograph shows the indigenous leader Hinma Tuya-Latkekt, known as Chief Joseph, a prominent spokesman for the Nez Perce people after the 1877 war. His serene features contrast with the memory of the arduous exodus of more than 2,000 kilometers toward Canada, interrupted by the surrender that symbolized Native resistance to U.S. expansion. In 1899, before the lens of F.A. Reinhardt Broken Arm, an Oglala Sioux representative, poses wearing a striped blanket and bead necklaces, symbols of enduring status and identity. The photograph is part of the series produced after the Trans-Mississippi Exposition in Omaha, when indigenous leaders were invited to document their presence under new federal rule. In 1890, during Buffalo Bill's Wild West show tour through Europe, Lakota chief Rocky Bear poses before members of the troupe in a camp set up in Verona, Italy. The image captures the moment when North American natives were showcased as part of the spectacle aiming to dramatize frontier scenes for foreign audiences. Cianina Redfeather, a mezzo-soprano singer of Creek and Cherokee descent, poses in the Dahl studio around 1920, when she was touring the United States performing the cantata The Sundance, composed in partnership with Charles Wakefield Cadman. The image reflects the moment when indigenous artists negotiated visibility and identity on stages dominated by Euro-American expectations. A mid-1920s photograph shows a Comanche child wrapped in a wooden and leather cradleboard in front of buildings in Lawton, Oklahoma, the town neighboring Fort Sill, where many Comanches were gathered after 1875. The scene documents traditional maternal practices preserved under the growing influence of federal assimilation policies. Hopi hairdresser adjusts the complex butterfly hairstyle on a young Tisut Nam, 1890, on the arid mesas of the Arizona Territory, a moment when Anglo-American photographers sought to catalog indigenous practices after federal incorporation. Wooden and bone tools shape the side spirals, a rite that precedes the ceremonial mantle and marks the transition to female adulthood. Donald Big Cow and his wife Kate, members of the Comanche Nation, appear mounted on horses around 1920, a period when many Plains peoples had already been confined to reservations and were trying to preserve equestrian traditions even under federal assimilation policies. The image reveals the continued centrality of the horse in Comanche cultural identity, decades after the Indian Wars. Light, an Oglala man photographed in 1884 when the Lakota people were under federal pressure following the Plains Wars. The scene was captured in a traveling studio shortly after the end of the buffalo hunts, a sign of the transition from a nomadic lifestyle to the Pine Ridge Reservation. In those years, leaders sought to maintain rituals such as the Sundance while the Dawes Act loomed to divide collective lands. Chief Irontail, Oglala leader photographed in 1916, appears as a veteran of the campaigns and Buffalo Bill's Wild West tours, which made him a symbol of the relationship between the Lakotas and the U.S. government after the closure of the reservations at the end of the 19th century. At that moment, indigenous citizenship policies and exhibition spectacles competed for the public narrative about the Lakota past. Bone Necklace, Oglala Sioux leader, poses in 1899 for the camera in Omaha during the Trans-Mississippi Exposition, an event that showcased indigenous cultures at a time when federal policies were pressing for assimilation and confinement to reservations. His clothing and ornaments reaffirm tribal identity and memories of the Plains resistance in the face of United States expansion. In 1907, Richard Throssell, photographer and honorary member of the Crow Nation, captured the image of a boy from the Pryor Creek Reservation, Montana, in an era of forced transition of indigenous traditions to federal education and imposed agriculture. The boy's attentive gaze reflects the tension between ancestral culture and the American government's assimilation policies. A Kia boat, also known as Two Axes Kiowa Leader, was photographed in 1898 by Frank A. Reinhardt during the Trans-Mississippi Exposition in Omaha. The solemn pose, the fur cap, and the shell pendants illustrate pan-tribal trade alliances and reaffirm Kiowa cultural persistence during a period of federal pressure for reservation assimilation. Enchanted Mesa, a rock formation sacred to the Acoma people, appears here observed from the eponymous village on the New Mexico Plateau. The scene, captured by Frederick Monson in the early 20th century, coincides with the period when anthropologists and photographers documented Pueblo spaces before the construction of federal roads that would alter the region's isolation. Photograph of a young Hopi woman in Oribe, Arizona, circa 1900, displaying the plaque hairstyle that signaled marriage eligibility according to community tradition. The scene is set in a period marked by federal indigenous assimilation policies, when glass plate cameras were beginning to capture aspects of daily life in the villages of the Colorado Plateau. Goshona, a member of the Apache people, was photographed in 1900 by Edward S. Curtis during his extensive project documenting indigenous nations at a time when federal policies accelerated confinement to reservations. The image highlights individual dignity amid the pressures of territorial loss and cultural transformation that marked the American Southwest at the turn of the 20th century. In 1877, Chin Chin Wet, wife of Weyutat Han, was photographed by Briggs at Warm Springs, Oregon. The image documents the period shortly after the creation of the Warm Springs Reservation, when Wasco and Paiute communities faced federal assimilation policies and loss of traditional territories, reflecting the tensions of the post-Modoc War American West. An 1880 photograph by C. Bell shows Medicine Crow, political and diplomatic leader of the Crow Nation, at a time when the United States government was intensifying treaties that restricted indigenous territories. The image documents the transition from tribal power to models imposed by Washington, and reveals Medicine Crow's role as a mediator between cultures. John Hollowhorn Bear, Brule Lakota chief, was photographed in 1898 by Frank A. Reinhardt during the Trans-Mississippi Exposition in Omaha. The image is part of the series commissioned to document indigenous representatives invited by the U.S. government to discuss reservation policies, showcase native cultures, and debate the future after the recent Sioux Wars.